Good afternoon to everybody. And the noise may be coming from my area. It's 6 a.m. where I am in Athens. So I'm in a cafeteria, which is very nicely allowing me to have the video now. And I hope that I can be heard. I want to thank you for inviting me and thank SHAPE for its leadership. And I just had the privilege to listen to Alison Brainovsky and Chung-In Moon. And these are brilliant statements that we've all been treated with. Absolutely insightful. I absolutely agree with all that has been said. The world has gone mad. But especially the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm afraid. I don't know whether there is any sense at all in our little English-speaking corner of the world. I'm, of course, speaking of the United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's something profoundly disheartening about the politics of our countries right now. The deep madness, I'm afraid, is British imperial thinking taken over by the United States. My country, the U.S., is unrecognizable now compared even to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, who runs the country. I do not believe it is the President of the United States right now. We are run by generals, by our security establishment. The public is privy to nothing. The lies that are told about foreign policy are daily and pervasive by a mainstream media that I can barely listen to or read anymore. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the main television outlets are 100% repeating government propaganda by the day. And it's almost impossible to break through. What is this about? Well, as you've heard, it's about a madness of the United States to keep U.S. hegemony. Militarized, dominated by the thinking of generals who are mediocre intellects, personally greedy, and without any sense, because their only modus operandi is to make war. And then cheerled by Britain, which is unfortunately in my adult life increasingly pathetic in being a cheerleader for the United States for this hegemony and for war. Whatever the US says, Britain will say it 10 times more enthusiastically. And it could not love more the war in Ukraine, which is the great second Crimean War for the British media and for the British political leadership. Now, how Australia and New Zealand fall for this idiocy is really a deep question for you, because people should know better, but I'm afraid that it is the Five Eyes and the security establishment that tell the politicians, to the extent that the politicians are involved in this, well, this is how we have to do it. This is our security state. And I don't think our politicians necessarily have much role in this. By the way, the public has no role at all in U.S. foreign policy at all. We have no debate, no discussion, no deliberation, no debates over voting the 113 billion, but in fact much more money spent on the Ukraine war so far. There's not been an hour of organized debate, even in the Congress, on this, much less in the public. But my guess is that your security establishment is really the driver of this. And then they explained to the prime minister and to the others, this is the utmost national security. And this is what America has told us, and let me explain what we're seeing. And of course, you cannot divulge this to the broader public, but this is at the essence of the struggle for survival in the world. Everything I see myself, I'm 43 years in this activity as an economic advisor all over the world, is nonsense. And one thing that would be interesting for people to look at to understand these developments is a very telling article by a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Robert Blackwell, and Ashley Tellis, written for the Council on Foreign Relations about 8 years ago now. I just want to read a couple excerpts from it because it laid out the whole plan of what's happening right now pretty directly, which is how things work in the U.S., which is through the establishment media, you're basically told in not necessarily completely explicit terms what's going to happen, because what is unfolding right now is really part of a longer term planned agenda. It's not ad hoc. So here's what Blackwell and Tellis wrote in 2015. First, quote, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." And then argues that this goal of primacy ought to remain the central objective of U.S. grand strategy in the 21st century. So what's the goal? The goal is very straightforward. It is primacy of the United States globally. Then Blackwell and Tellis lay out the game plan for China. So they tell us what to do. Here's the list. I'm only excerpting. Quote, "Create new preferential trading arrangements among U.S. friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China." Okay, this is the game that already Obama started with TPP. He couldn't get it through, but I'll go on and then I'll comment. Second, create a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, to build up, quote, "power political capacities of U.S. friends and allies on China's periphery," and strengthen U.S. military forces along the Asian rimlands, despite any Chinese opposition. What I find remarkable about this is this was a list made in 2015. It's exactly the step-by-step plan of action. This is repeated in recent history. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski, in an article in Foreign Affairs, laid out exactly the timeline for NATO enlargement and the intention to include Ukraine in NATO enlargement, because this was already the security establishment plan. Of course, it's led us directly to the Ukraine war, which is a war over NATO enlargement. Now the friends that have, and the geniuses that have brought the world the Ukraine war, want to bring the war to your neighborhood with, as Professor Moon said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization starting to open its offices in Asia, which is not exactly the North Atlantic. So this is where we are. It's not absolutely simple to see through for one main reason, at least in the US. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I expect that it's the same. We have no honesty or discussion at all about this. The policies are owned entirely by the security establishment, the military-industrial complex, the network of, quote, think tanks, which are non-think tanks in Washington, every one of which is funded by the military-industrial complex. They've taken over the East Coast universities entirely, where I teach. I taught 20 years at Harvard. I teach at Columbia University. This is our milieu right now. And the silent coup happened, in essence. No debate, no public politics, no honesty, no documents revealed, everything secret, everything confidential, and mysterious moves. And since I happen to be an economist that engages with heads of state around the world, I hear a lot of things. And so I've seen and heard a lot of things directly, which help me to understand the lies every day. But you will not find any of this in our public discourse. Just a word about the Ukraine war. Completely predictable and part of a plan of action that goes back to the early 1990s to essentially bring Ukraine into the US military orbit. And Brzezinski, again in 1997 in the Global Chessboard, his geopolitical book, laid it out completely. Russia without Ukraine is nothing. Ukraine is the geographical pivot for Eurasia, and basically go get it. Interestingly, Brzezinski said in 1997 in the book, but the one thing absolutely American policymakers need to ensure is that they don't push Russia and China into an alliance together. But then he says, that's pretty much unthinkable. Don't worry about that, but that would be the craziest thing in the world. And it's exactly what these crazy people have done. I happen to have been an advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin, and to Kuchma in the early days of both the late days of perestroika and the early days after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I watched very closely what was happening. I saw that the United States was absolutely uninterested in any way in helping Russia to stabilize. The idea from the start was unipolarity, keep Russia down, and take steps already decided in 1992, basically, in direct contradiction to what had been told to Gorbachev and Yeltsin to start expanding NATO. So this is a game plan with a long horizon. When it comes to China, and by the way, the U.S. was deeply implicated in the overthrow of Ukraine's president in 2014. It was a coup. It was to an important extent a regime change operation of the United States, not entirely, but to a very significant extent. I happen to see part of it in a very weird way up close, and I know how U.S. money poured into supporting the Maidan, and it was incredibly disgusting and very unnerving, and Putin noticed that the U.S. contributed to the overthrow of a friendly government next door, in the context of the explicit intention to push NATO, by the way, not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia. And when one looks at the map, it's Brzezinski's idea: surround Russia in the Black Sea region. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all be members of NATO. That would be the end of Russian power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So go these geniuses. And Putin gave many opportunities for negotiation out of this. The Minsk agreements endorsed by the UN Security Council in 2021, December 17, he put on the table a perfectly reasonable document for negotiation, the draft U.S.-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO expansion. The U.S. blew it off. I called the White House after that was put on the table, spoke to one of our top security officials, and said, negotiate. Stop the NATO enlargement. You have a chance to avoid war. The United States' formal response to Putin was, NATO is non-negotiable. This is something only between the U.S. and Ukraine, and Russia has no say in NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It's a mind-boggling way to pursue foreign affairs because it is a direct road to war. As you know, I hope everybody understands, this war in Ukraine was close to ending in March 2022 with a negotiated agreement a month after Russia invaded on February 24th, with an agreement between Ukraine and Russia that the United States stopped because the U.S. said, fight on, don't negotiate, don't accept neutrality. And so here we are in a war that continues to escalate towards possible nuclear war, which is what would happen if Russia were to suffer deep defeats on the battlefield. It's not doing that right now. It's not experiencing that. But if it did, it just escalates to nuclear war. Russia is not going to be defeated, pushed out of Crimea, and go home meekly and saying, we're sorry we did that. It's going to escalate if it needs to escalate. So we are right now in a spiral that is extremely dangerous. Japan plays utterly into this. And Australia, it's so sad to watch Australia in a accepting to be used in this reckless way, to pay a fortune to be used in this reckless and provocative way. And U.S. actions, by and large, till now, with very few exceptions, U.S. actions are putting us on a path to war with China in the same way that U.S. actions did in Ukraine. Only this war, well, either war could end everything. But the whole idea of the U.S. and its allies fighting China is mind-boggling in its implications, in its stupidity, in its profound dangers, and in its utter divorce from real security interests and from reality, because China is not a threat to Australia. It is not a threat to the world. And last time I looked, correct me because there's some experts in the room, many more than I, but I don't know of a single overseas Chinese invasion in its history, by the way, other than on the borders. I don't know in its whole history, except when the Mongols briefly ruled China and tried to invade Japan. Other than the Mongol invasion, defeated by a typhoon, other than that, I don't know of another single case in 2,200 years of Chinese statecraft. So this is not exactly at the top of my worry list. This is what worries me about the world is a deeply neurotic United States that aims to be number one, that can't be number one in the way that it self-believes to be number one, that has a pathetic, and I'm sorry to use the term, but it is pathetic, cheerleader in London every day saying how wonderful it is. Empire is great. You should go try it. We love it.
Jeffrey,
I'm going to stop here. Sorry to go on and on, but let me just, if I could, 1 minute to say what should be done. The war in Ukraine could end the day after Biden steps up and says NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. Believe it. The basis for negotiation has been there for 20 years and rejected by the U.S. Second, the idea of opening NATO offices in Asia is mind-boggling in its risk and its stupidity. And please tell the Japanese, stop this. It's reckless. Third, the U.S. approach to Taiwan, except in a glimmer of reality of Blinken last month, is profoundly dangerous, provocative, and deliberately so. Fourth, what is needed is regional dialogue in Asia, among Asians and among the Asia Pacific. And fifth, use RCEP, because RCEP is actually the correct concept for the region, to bring together China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand in a coherent framework, especially around the climate challenge, energy policy, trade policy, investment policy, would do a world of good, not only for the 15 in the Asia Pacific, but for the entire world. Sorry to have run on so long and to ramble, but it's so important what SHAPE is doing. You're completely on the right track, and all best wishes to your efforts. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the warm greeting and for the opportunity to be together with you. Thank you for the work that you do all over the world. Work with compassion and wisdom and technical expertise. This is exactly what the world needs. And we can feel, Sonia and I were just saying, this wonderful atmosphere and the wonderful people here. We can feel the compassion and your dedication, and it's very moving and very inspiring to be together with you. This has been quite a week with the Tang Prize and visiting here and at Suzhou University and hearing all those nice things said about you. I just want the week to continue, if I might. But I want to thank you so warmly for such a gracious and wonderful week in Taiwan. There is no problem that we're facing that we cannot solve. In fact, it's rather absurd as well as tragic that we are still facing problems of extreme poverty in this world. As of today, the average income on the planet, averaged over the 8 billion inhabitants of the planet, is $13,000 per year. $13,000 is enough to live well, to not be in hunger, to have access to education and health care, water, safe water, sanitation, modern services, digital connectivity. In other words, the average income is enough to take care of everybody, and much more than enough to take care of everybody. The fact that we are in a world, however, in which billions of people are struggling, many are dying because of poverty, and we are fighting over resources is a matter of our mindset. It is not a matter of our physical or material reality or the lack of technological solutions. That's why it's so appropriate to be in a Buddhist setting, because all of the teaching of Buddhism is about mindset. It's the way we view the reality, not the reality itself, that leads to the suffering. The suffering can be escaped if we understand correctly our own attitudes and the nature of the world that we're in. So that is what I hope we can explore together this morning. How can we better use our knowledge our technology, our vast wealth to end the suffering of material deprivation, of hunger, of lack of access to the most basic services, because this is absolutely feasible. The most important answer, of course, is that we redirect our attention, our activities, our resources to those needs. It would not require heroism to do it. It would require basic common sense. We are spending in the world today, by the most recent estimates, $2.2 trillion on military outlays alone. $2.2 trillion per year is more than enough to end all extreme poverty. My country, the United States, shockingly, is 40% of that military spending, $1 trillion per year. It's a deranged political system which happily votes for military outlays but refuses to vote for compassionate outlays. And this is deeply embedded in our political system today. And it's making the world so much more dangerous, so much more unequal, and so much more crisis-ridden than can be imagined. And by the way, it does nothing for the American people. This is not even a case of America exploiting the world. It's America endangering the world and ruining itself at the same time. Our life expectancy in the United States has declined now for the last 9 years. Our life expectancy now is 76 years, lower than in China, much lower than in Taiwan, 9 years behind Japan, and yet we are so rich that this is simply, again, a mindset crisis and translated into institutions that do not function. And in all of that, as our life expectancy has declined for the last 9 years, our Congress has done almost nothing except raise military spending. We call it military spending, we call it defense spending, but it's not defense at all. It's offensive spending. We heard The Economist magazine, I didn't know this quotation saying that Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world. Beware of Anglo-Saxon publications, first of all. But let me say a word about danger and ways out of danger, if I may. The only place in Central America that is not in violent conflict is the country of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is extremely interesting because in 1948, Costa Rica unilaterally eliminated its military. It banished the army. It has no army. All the rest of Central America has an army. But Costa Rica is the only country to have avoided war. Having an army does not lead to peace. It does not lead to safety. Having an army leads to coups or provocation or perceived threats from outside or manipulation from outside, especially since the U.S. trains so many of the military. But it doesn't lead to safety. And my wife and I spent the past year while I was working at UNIDO in Vienna, living in a very interesting context. Austria was one of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Almost all of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II had the Soviet troops on their territory until 1989, typically in very repressive conditions. Austria was an exception. The Soviet troops went home voluntarily from Austria in 1955. It's a very interesting case to understand about war and peace. What happened that led the Soviet Union to voluntarily withdraw from Austria and then leave Austria alone for all of the period from 1955 until today? Was it that Austria is part of NATO? No. Austria, in fact, is the one country in the region not part of NATO. What happened in 1955 was that Austria clearly declared its neutrality, that it would never accept NATO or American troops or weaponry, that it would be a neutral country. And on that basis, the Soviet Union left, because Austria was not a threat. And so the troops went home. Austria became a vibrant democratic country, a really wonderful country, by the way, that has a tremendous quality of life and culture. And it was never once threatened by the Soviet Union or Russia since then, not in one single moment or one single episode, because it was not a threat to the Soviet Union or to Russia. It was a neutral country. It's a very instructive and almost completely forgotten episode in history. And it's an episode that deserves a tremendously deeper understanding, not only for Austria, but for what might have been in the world. Because one of the reasons that the Soviet Union made that step was that it wanted to set an example. The message in 1955 was, if a country becomes neutral, we leave. And the aim of the Soviet Union in 1955 was to try to convince the United States to have Germany be a neutral country. This is very interesting because, of course, Nazi Germany had caused more than 20 million deaths in the Soviet Union. And at the end of 1945, the Soviet Union, which had been more destroyed and had suffered more than any other country in the total deaths, demanded demilitarization of Germany. The United States said no. Starting in the late 1940s, the US started to arm Germany. And by 1951, the US zone of occupation, together with the British and French zone of occupation, had become the Federal Republic of Germany and had been incorporated into the new US military alliance, into NATO. And the Russians, The Soviets were very concerned about this because this was a remilitarization of a country that just a few years earlier had invaded and caused more than 20 million deaths. And the Soviet Union was saying to the United States, we need a peace treaty. We need an agreement. We need to stop the remilitarization of Germany. And the US was saying, no, we are NATO. We're against you. We will defend against you. And after Stalin's death and Khrushchev coming to power in 1955, the Soviet Union tried again. And the Austrian state declared its neutrality, and the Soviet army went home. And the message was, neutralize Germany and we can end the threat to us and we can find a new peace arrangement in Europe. The United States completely rejected the idea, said we will not have a neutral Germany, we'll have a militarized Germany. Our leading diplomat and historian in 1955, our greatest Russia expert, George Kennan, argued vigorously, let us have a neutral Germany. This way we'll have peace. This way we can end the confrontation with the Soviet Union. He was the author, no less, of the containment policy. But he said, I don't mean containment to be a new Cold War or hot war. I mean it to be a prudent policy. We should neutralize Germany. And in 1957, he gave the BBC Wreath lectures calling for this, but he wasn't listened to. So we had a Cold War and an arms race and no peace, and nearly blew up the world in 1962, 61 years ago, because of a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the roots of that, if you look deeply, actually involve Berlin and Germany. If you look deeply at the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was about the same issue. This is almost completely not understood, except by our finest historians. But it's not the way we tell the story at all. So the US gave up the chance for peace. Miraculously, the world survived. Then arose a very wise and peaceful and peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was truly a great man, an incredibly decent person. I had the privilege to be on his economic advisory team for 1 year, trying to help mobilize Western support for a collapsing Soviet economy. I failed completely in that because the US, again, was uninterested in doing anything, even to help a peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union. And as you know, Mr. Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact military alliance in 1990. And at that moment, the leaders of the United States and Germany promised Gorbachev, we will not take advantage of that by expanding NATO even 1 inch eastward in response to your action. Of course, Gorbachev fell the next year, in part because of the financial crisis that the Soviet Union was facing, that the United States refused to help. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the strategists in the Pentagon and the White House and the CIA immediately began to plan the expansion of NATO. And so again, the US turned down peace. It could not take yes for an answer. I happen to be rather deeply inside the process in the Soviet, then Russian side, because after Mr. Gorbachev fell from power, President Yeltsin asked me to help advise Russia. I said, surely, Mr. President, the United States will understand now to give financial help. Maybe it could not understand with the Soviet Union, but surely with an independent Russia now. And again, the United States absolutely said we're not helping at all. And so just as these two leaders were saying, we want peace, we want normalcy, we want the end of conflict, the United States began planning the unipolar world. Quite literally planning step by step. Even leaders in the Pentagon told one of the generals that I know rather well, Wesley Clark, that now the United States will launch several wars to overthrow Russian allied governments because we now know that Russia can do nothing in response. This is what Clark was told in the early 1990s. And the list included Iraq with Saddam Hussein, Syria with Assad, Libya with Muammar Gaddafi. And those are the wars that came. Those were planned wars. And the NATO enlargement was planned starting in 1992, but really planned in detail by 1997. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the strategist and advisor to President Carter, wrote an article in 1997 explaining the timeline of NATO enlargement to Ukraine to be between 2005 and 2010. Of course, the Russian leadership said, no, don't do that. That's our red line. Don't cross it. The United States said, we don't hear you. You don't have any say in this. It's literally NATO doctrine, literally. It's enshrined in NATO doctrine that no country outside of NATO has any say in where NATO will enlarge, even if NATO is enlarging to a 2,000-kilometer border of the country. So the United States said, we will enlarge to Ukraine, and Russia, you have no say in it whatsoever. In 2007, President Putin said, don't do this. Do not do this. We're very concerned. We do not want you on our border. The United States. The United States ignored that, and in 2008 committed to NATO enlargement. This is why we have the war in Ukraine. The unrelenting pursuit of power and not listening to anybody else, to any prudent warnings at all. Interestingly, in 2008, the US ambassador to Russia rode a secret cable back to Washington. That ambassador was William Burns. He's now the CIA director. His secret memo got leaked by WikiLeaks, so we got to read it. because other than leaks, we don't read anything of what the US government really thinks. Everything is secret. And the media are not storm media. They are USG media. So we read literally nothing but what the US government wants us to read. But this memo was made public by Assange. And the title of the memo is Niet means Niet. And the content of the memo was, it is not just a matter of President Putin, it is every member of the leadership of Russia that opposes NATO enlargement. Pro-Putin, anti-Putin, doesn't matter. All Russian political class does not want NATO on Russia's border. And by the way, I don't blame them for one moment. Who would want NATO on your border? Not I. But it was ignored again. Kennan was ignored, Burns was ignored, Jack Matlock, our US ambassador to the Soviet Union, was ignored. William Perry, our Secretary of Defense, was ignored. The ones that were listened to were Raytheon. They have military establishments in every congressional district. It's jobs, it's money. They pay for all the think tanks on the East Coast. It's big business. Biden has been part of that for more than 30 years. But basically every president is by the time they get there. And so the US could not listen to a red line. And then I won't go through all of the rest of the history because this is not our main topic, but it really is our main topic. In 2014, the US helped to overthrow the last Ukrainian government that just wanted calm, because President Viktor Yanukovych wanted neutrality. He's being pulled by the US on one side, he's being pulled by Russia on the other side. He's trying to keep calm. So he gets the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, to vote for neutrality. Smart man. Then Europe is saying, you must sign our agreement with us now, now, now. And President Putin's saying, no, don't sign. You will divert trade. We are your major trading partner. We have to be part of this trade agreement. And Europe is saying, Russia, you have nothing to do with this. And Russia's saying, yes, but you are making a trade agreement. We already have a trade agreement with Ukraine. We're party to this. No, no, you have nothing to do with this. Because this is a game. This is not honesty. This is not grown-up behavior. And so a protest started when Yanukovych delayed signing the agreement with the European Union. And the US stoked the protest behind the scenes, pouring huge amounts of money into the protest, funding it. I know it. I saw it with my own eyes, by the way. Leading American NGOs working side by side with the government, pouring in vast money for that protest. Not saying we don't want to interfere, directly leading the protest. And then a violent overthrow of the government, and the new government came in and said, we want NATO. And then the United States said, we'll make you safe. We'll give you lots of armaments. You'll be perfectly safe. And so the US started a mass sale of arms to Ukraine, guaranteed to destroy the country. Absolutely. Clear as could be. They did it. They absolutely destroyed the country. Because at the end of 2021, President Putin made one last try, stop NATO enlargement. And on December 17th, 2021, he put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. And he had some very important correct points. And I'm not a Putin apologist. I am an objective observer over the last 30 years. President Putin observed the following. First, stop NATO enlargement to our border. Second, the U.S. had walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2002, and it had basically ended. It started to place Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Putin said, we don't even know what is in those silos, but it's a few minutes from Moscow. This is intolerable. You unilaterally left a treaty. Now we are vulnerable. The United States said, we don't negotiate with you. And in January 2022, the U.S. gave a formal reply to Putin. And the formal reply is, NATO enlargement is none of your business. Literally, that is U.S. policy. It's none of your business. Not that we will sit down and discuss, negotiate, try to understand your security concerns. It's none of your business. I actually called the White House on December 30th, 2021, and spoke to one of the top officials, not to the president, and begged them, negotiate, avoid a war. No, Jeffrey, we don't have to negotiate. It's not really about NATO, I was told. I said, if it's not about NATO, say that NATO won't enlarge. No, we can't do that. And on February 21st, 2022, Russia Security Council met. President Putin asked Foreign Minister Lavrov, give a report of the status of your discussions with the Americans. Lavrov responded that we have received a firm reply of no negotiation over NATO. We have tried, Mr. President, but we did not succeed. The U.S. will not engage in negotiations. And 3 days later, the special military operation took place. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are killed. 10 million have fled the country. The economic collapse is probably more than 50%. Ukraine is losing around 1,000 soldiers every day, killed or seriously wounded right now. This so-called offensive or counteroffensive is a death trap. And the U.S. knows it, but we have a presidential election coming up, so we can't quite say it, because that might be embarrassing for the president. And so Ukraine is told, keep throwing your soldiers 1,000 a day to their death or to their permanent disability. And they keep doing it. That's why we don't have sustainable development. Because we're not even trying. How many times has President Biden said sustainable development goals? I literally do not know one occasion where he has used the phrase. Can you imagine? I don't know of one occasion. One of my closest associates over the last 40 years, who was a senior U.S. official for a while, told me that it is U.S. Treasury policy not to use the phrase Sustainable Development Goals, because they're afraid that some Republicans in Congress will object that it's going to put America on the hook with all those poor people. And America doesn't want to hear that. And to give you a real status of the world right now, every country is supposed to have a Sustainable Development Goal plan. And they're supposed to present it to their peers at the UN high-level political forum. And each year, 30 to 40 countries present their plans to the delegates. There are 193 UN member states, and 188 of them have made their plans known to the others. These are called voluntary national reviews, VNRs. 5 countries, only 5 in the whole UN, have not made Sustainable Development Goal plans. They are South Sudan, which has been in nonstop war, Haiti, which is in complete disaster, Yemen, which has been in nonstop war, Myanmar, which has been in nonstop conflict, and one more, the United States of America. Those are the 5. This is why we don't have sustainable development. As an economist, I've taken a particular view of this issue over the last 30 years as I came to understand it, starting in the early 1990s. And that is that for some of the things that poor people need, their governments simply cannot afford to provide them out of their own resources. So we need a world that has compassion, that provides some of the things that the poorest of the poor cannot provide on their own. And so starting around 30 years ago, I have been advocating basically nonstop that there should be more financial flows from the rich to the poor, so that children in poor countries can go to school, so that they can be immunized, so that they can have a dose of anti-malarial medicine if they have a bout of malaria, and so on. And a lot of what I've done for 30 years is basic arithmetic. Thank goodness for Excel spreadsheets. I have multiplied the number of poor people by the cost of interventions, and I have shown that that amount is very small, but it's larger than the budget of the government of the impoverished country. So I have said, here is a gap, and we should fill the gap. It's not ingenious work. It's so simple that it should be absolutely the most basic exercise that any institution involved in sustainable development makes. Now, I want to explain 2 interesting facts about these calculations, beyond the fact that they show that a country like Niger, which just had a coup a couple of days ago, could never afford to have all its kids in school, given the impoverishment that it finds itself in right now. Maybe in 30 years it could, but right now it needs help. But here are 2 interesting facts. One is the IMF never uses such a calculation to decide how to address Niger or another low-income country in its actual budget programming. In other words, when the finance minister of Niger comes and the income in that country is a few $100s per person per year, and half the kids are not in school, and only 10% of the population has access to electricity, and so on, the finance minister comes to the IMF, and the IMF says, well, you have this much money, so learn to live with it, or die with it. Oh, you would like to have electricity? That's a privilege. Don't expect it. And that's literally, well, they don't say it that way. They just say, be careful, be prudent, don't spend more than you have. Not, we will help you to find the financing. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is interesting for right now. In the last 2 years, I've been advising the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, on what is the size of this financing gap and how could it be mobilized. And one basic part of the answer is the official banks that we established decades ago, like the African Development Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, need to be operating at a much larger scale because you have the needs and you have the current scale of operation, so the scale should be increased. And on that basis, Secretary General Guterres called for what we called an SDG stimulus, a financial stimulus to help close the gap of what is needed to be spent versus what is available for spending. Very straightforward. And it would involve the rich countries as a group putting in something like $100 billion a year. For the United States, $20 billion a year, for example. Now, we're a $25 trillion economy. So $20 billion is rounding error. It's not even noticeable. $250 billion is 1% of GDP. $25 billion is 0.1 of 1% of GDP. So this is 0.08 of 1% of GDP. You know what the United States just said last week? It said, we don't think it's timely to increase the capital of the multilateral development banks. Translation. The President of the United States does not want to say a word about this because maybe Congress would object and say you're wasting U.S. taxpayer money on poor people. Maybe the rich would have to pay a little bit more in tax, but that's impossible because the rich finance the whole political system. And so the U.S. says it's not timely. For who? For the people who don't have enough to eat today? For the child who's not in school today? Who's it not timely for? It's not timely for the American plutocracy. That's all. So I don't really know whether economics is needed in any of this anymore. We need Buddhism. We need compassion. We need Ren. We need benevolence. I've come to believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are as simple as the ABCs: Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. Aristotle, by the way, who's my favorite philosopher because I know him well, he is at the core of the glorious side of the Western philosophical tradition. had the basic idea of human beings, that human beings are a mix of animal instincts and higher rationality. And it is our purpose, our end, to think and to behave properly as rational human beings, including decently in our social order, in our political order. The Buddha, of course, and I'm here to learn from you, taught compassion as the basis of escaping the cycle of suffering. And Confucius taught virtue and cultivating virtue. And he taught that all people are brothers within the four C's, that this is one humanity and one world. If we abide by the ABCs, we will achieve sustainable development. Thank you very much.
In light of the United States-India summit held in Washington in June, do you think the meeting between President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also highlights a shift in the global balance of power?
A profound and extensive change is taking place in the world. Let's put it this way. The non-Western parts of the world are experiencing rapid economic growth. I'm talking about countries like India, China, certain parts of Africa, and Latin America, which were poor in the past 2 centuries, but are currently showing significant progress in catching up. If you consider the European Union with a population of around 450 million and the United States with 335 million inhabitants, it accounts for only 10% of the world's population. So the majority of the world, which is still relatively poor, but reducing the gap, lies outside of this.
Seeing this, do you think the United States and the West can accept that there is a certain shift towards developing countries? In fact, it's not just towards developing countries, but towards economic powers such as China or India. Will the West accept that it no longer exclusively wields global influence?
I believe that Europe roughly understands this, although ideas about a European empire still arise occasionally, but these are mostly remnants of the past. In the United States, there is a very strong financial and ideological entity known as the military-industrial complex, which currently does not accept this viewpoint. In my opinion, it represents a significant destabilizing factor in the world. This entity still wants the United States to be dominant over Russia and China. They think that the United States will create an anti-China alliance with India, but this is a very naive and unrealistic notion. I think the majority of the American people are not concerned about whether the United States is the first, second, or fifth largest power in the world because we have so many problems at home. The American people would be completely happy if their government focused on the problems that have accumulated domestically. However, the mentioned military-industrial complex is a strong and dominant player in American foreign policy, which still imagines that the United States is the leading superpower. Furthermore, many European countries, at least currently, subscribe to this idea because many European leaders confuse the European Union with NATO and unfortunately equate them, which is a regrettable mistake. So, my answer is that a good and peaceful transition to a truly multipolar world is possible, but there are those who oppose it in the United States.
You mentioned the defense industry, which is a huge economic sector and a source of revenue and profit for the industries involved. This brings us immediately to the issue of the war in Ukraine, in which Russia is the aggressor. Yet the question arises, who benefits from peace and ending this bloody war?
This war broke out because the United States insisted on NATO expanding eastward and pushed for this to happen in Ukraine and Georgia as well. However, Ukraine and Georgia are red lines that cannot be crossed for Russia. Don't do it, the Russians said. The United States, however, was so dismissive, despite the fact that for 3 decades, Russia has been saying, don't dare bring your missiles, bases, and armies to Ukraine, that America thought they were just bluffing. What could Russia do, as it is so weak, and we can do whatever we want. However, President Putin called their bluff. The United States still insists on NATO's presence in Ukraine, and even NATO leaders say they will, of course, expand the organization to Ukraine. Most European leaders, with the exception of Prime Minister Orban, say that NATO will naturally expand to Ukraine. But this is the recipe for endless war and crisis. Thus, the Russian-Ukrainian war was provoked by American aspirations for hegemony. And if we had left Russia alone, had not confronted it with the possibility of NATO expansion in Ukraine, this war would never have broken out.
At the same time, Washington argues that Western military support only serves to assist Ukraine in protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States claims to support Ukraine as long as necessary. But where are the hopes for a peace agreement?
There could have been peace in December 2021 when President Putin put a draft agreement on the table with the United States, which was based on Ukraine's neutrality. But Washington rejected it. There could have been peace in April 2022 when Russia and Ukraine negotiated an agreement based on Ukraine's neutrality. The United States rejected that too. The day when the President of the United States, Joe Biden, came out in public and said that Russia must call home its army and the United States will never allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. This could have been the basis for ending the war. But Biden is unwilling to say this because he disagrees. He has been among those who support NATO expansion for 30 years, as does his environment, as do the top brass of the American military, the generals. They do not want peace. They want continuing war until the United States achieves its goal.
I attended a press conference led by John Kirby, the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, who argued that the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy is one of cooperation. Over the past 2 years, however, we have seen unprecedented political and economic division develop globally. This raises the question, how effective is this cooperative foreign policy, and how successful is it?
In this sense, Biden is a neoconservative, having been part of the aforementioned military-industrial complex throughout his congressional career as vice president and now as president. He doesn't support collaboration with others whom he calls allies and friends. He says that the greatest challenge and basis for division in the world today is the divide between democracies and autocracies. However, this is nonsense. And it's dangerous because the world is not structured that way and it should not be so bifurcated. The world should be unified in order to face common challenges, whether it's in regards to the functioning of the world economy, the preservation of the natural environment, or the ever-increasing uncertainty. And yet we don't do this, but instead try to expand NATO, increase military budgets, and speak aggressively about China. After Secretary of State Blinken's seemingly reasonable and constructive visit to Beijing, the next day, President Biden restarted and called President Xi Jinping a dictator. One wonders what kind of China policy this is. The world does not want this kind of destabilization. It does not need this foreign policy. The United States must contribute to ending the war in Ukraine, understanding that Russia also has legitimate security interests. These must be negotiated also to protect Ukraine and ensure that the security interests of every country are upheld.
Actually, the first lie came when the Soviet Union shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2 spy plane with Gary Powers, just on the eve of what was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Soviet Party Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA lies for a living, we know this, but it lied to the President of the United States also, saying, Mr. President, don't worry, they can't shoot down the spy plane, it's too high, and if they do shoot down the spy plane, it's designed to disintegrate, and if it doesn't disintegrate anyway, the pilot is going to take his cyanide pill. There's no way anything can happen to embarrass you. And of course, they shoot down the spy plane, they get the wreckage, they get the pilot alive, Gary Powers. They don't announce that. They say we have been spied upon and downed a plane without revealing those details. And Eisenhower comes out and says, no, this is a weather craft that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets reveal, we have the fuselage, we have the pilot who has told us about his spy mission, direct, blatant lies. Then soon after this comes the direct, blatant lies of the Bay of Pigs. It's dangerous. And this is the CIA, by the way, and it's the CIA till today, in my view. It is lying and unaccountable, and really never called to task for these lies because the public doesn't know them, doesn't understand what's going on. But from the Soviet U.S. point of view, within months of the Kennedy administration, this air was poisoned. And there was one other thing that was absolutely precipitating all of this, which was, and very fundamental and completely never discussed in America almost at all, but there had been no peace treaty at the end of World War II. And the Cold War emerged, in fact, over a bitter dispute between the Soviet Union and the United States about the future of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people in the war and did not want to see German remilitarized. The United States, on the other hand, decided that the three occupied regions from the western side, the U.S., French, and British regions, would form a single new Federal Republic of Germany. The remaining fourth part, the Soviet-occupied part, would become the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But the western side would become the bulwark of a new military alliance, NATO, and it would be remilitarized. And the Soviet Union said, no, we just lost more than 20 million people. Now, within a few years, you're remilitarizing. Well, of course, the United States never listened, never negotiated, and at the end of the 1950s, took another step. Eisenhower was flirting with the idea, maybe we should just give our allies control over nuclear weapons as well, so we can reduce the U.S. Troops numbers in Europe. Eisenhower was very frugal. He was a fiscal conservative, and he wanted to bring troops home and use the nuclear shield. And so there was, at the end of the 1950s, lots of talk about nuclear sharing. And this was freaking out the Soviet Union also. And the United States doesn't know how to talk to anybody. There's no diplomacy. There are mortal enemies. There's no one to negotiate. And so the situation by the time Kennedy came in was completely fraught. Then came the Bay of Pigs. Then Khrushchev said, okay, we need to teach Americans a bit of their own lessons. We'll put missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev had a quite remarkable exchange with Andrei Gromyko, as foreign minister. Gromyko said, no, what, war? And Khrushchev said, no, not war, just basically teach these Americans about their arrogance. They have missiles in Turkey. We're going to put missiles in Cuba. Nothing about war. But of course, everything immediately spiraled out of control when the missile placements were discovered and the subterfuge that the Soviets were using to place the missile systems in place. And it was like the subterfuge of the United States doing what it did on its side. Things get out of hand. And as soon as Kennedy saw the U-2 spy plane over Cuba taking these pictures of missile sites, he convened an executive committee, ExComm, and it was almost unanimous. Well, we got to shoot down these sites. We have to take them out before they can be deployed. And it was unanimous, essentially, that there needed to be an immediate war, and the Joint Chiefs were told to go off and plan the military campaign against Cuba. Would it be an air campaign? Would it just be to take out the sites? How many troops would be needed, and so forth? Kennedy, interestingly, to make a very long story short, had lunch by coincidence with Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations on the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis when Kennedy had seen the pictures. And Adlai Stevenson said to Kennedy, well, of course you need diplomacy to end this and, exchange the missiles with the Turkish missiles. Kennedy was shocked because no other advisor had said anything about diplomacy. It was basically unanimous for a military approach, which, by the way, almost surely may be too strong, although I'm not sure it is, but most likely would have led to nuclear annihilation. Because our doctrine was that if we were attacked by a nuclear weapon, we would give a full response. By the way, full meaning not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe, China, hundreds of millions of people killed. And now we learned afterwards from the nuclear winter, maybe all of humanity perishing from starvation afterwards. But Stevenson laid the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement. Well, to make a long story short, as people know, Kennedy really almost alone, though with this hint from Stevenson, and then with his brother Robert pushing and Ted Sorensen pushing and a few others pushing, turned the tide over a few days that don't do something precipitous. Let's try to figure out what's in Khrushchev's mind. And Kennedy came to realize, because he had people like the Air Force head, Curtis LeMay, who just wanted nuclear war, it seems, or a first strike against the Soviet Union, that he was surrounded by a lot of hotheads who could end the world. And he realized Khrushchev probably was as well. And the two of them came to realize we better tamp this down. And they did. And they agreed on a deal of this removal of missiles, both from Cuba and from Turkey. The big mistake Kennedy made, and I always think it's unfair to call it a mistake because he saved the world, so you get a lot of credit for that. But the mistake he made was insisting that the deal be secret, so that it looked to the American people like he had simply faced down the Soviet Union and they had backed away, because it wasn't known that the removal of the American missiles were part of an exchange. And that wasn't known for decades, actually.
So let's talk about how Kennedy changed and what he set out to do. And of course, it was all cut short by his assassination in November of 1963.
I think first it's fair to say that being president of the United States is a tough job. And it's impossible to do right in the early days and early years because you don't get it. And our security state in the United States, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947, which created a secret security state and a private army of the United States called the CIA, which is one half its function because it does intelligence and it does private warfare of the United States. And the whole apparatus is secret and largely out of control. And it is absolutely out of control by any public understanding or scrutiny or accountability or congressional oversight today as it was in the early 1960s. Well, Kennedy came in with a lot of energy and idealism and brilliance, and he stumbled terribly in the first year with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban invasion, and then in the second year, the near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my view is he had the potential for greatness at the beginning, and by his third year, he had become a magnificent politician and statesman of the first order, one of our truly great presidents. Not so much in the first 2 years, although the potential was there, but the growth that came through this set of trials was extraordinary. Already after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so disturbed by the CIA that he was beside himself about how they had led the U.S. and his administration and himself personally into this awful debacle. He didn't trust the CIA. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and after hearing people like Curtis LeMay even essentially calling Kennedy a traitor for not launching the war or a coward, and feeling all of this pressure for war, he was profoundly disturbed and profoundly moved and profoundly scared at how fragile the world was. And he was determined to do something in 1963. And
Let me just interject. He fired Dulles and he fired Bissell. So he actually took on the CIA establishment and triggered deep animus. And I want you, as you go on, to talk about this speech. But one of the things I found fascinating from your book is how few people he informed about what it was he was about to say. And so I want to make sure we talk about the content of what he said.
So Kennedy wanted to say to the American people, peace is possible, even with the Soviet Union, even with the other side. And the whole content of the speech is they are human beings like we are. They want to live. They want to protect their children. They want to have a future. And this speech is unbelievable because it's the only foreign policy speech I know of anywhere where it is not telling the other side what to do, not making threats, not reveling in glory, not saying we are number one, not saying they are evil, but saying to the American people, we need to reconsider our own position. And remember, today we're told every day by the completely irresponsible, reckless, and ignorant mass media like the New York Times, I'm going to say, because it's terrible, and like the Washington Post and others, there's no one to talk to. There's no one to negotiate with over Ukraine. And in the Cold War in 1963, it was even more like that. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. Could you even imagine negotiating with the Soviet Union? And Kennedy's whole message is, we can negotiate. They want the same things. They too will abide by treaties as long as those treaties are also in their interest. And they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out, through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I want to read three short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I mean, this is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty, and Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful. By the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, give me a place to stand and I can move the world. Fellow leaders of the world, let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get
We
more
don't-
evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And, it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control. And in any event, has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop. It's a red line. Stop. And then not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time.